Welcome to Weekly News Highlights, where we wrap up your week with a glimpse back into what went on in the past week. I'm Kim Dami in Seoul. Let's first look back using keywords. A big step taken by the country this week to untangle much knotted ties with Japan over the issue of compensating Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. Victims will receive donations from South Korean companies rather than the Japanese firms responsible. A proposal widely welcomed by world leaders, but not everyone is in the same boat. South Korean leader Yoon Suk-yeol will head to Washington, D.C. next month to mark the 70th anniversary of alliance with the U.S. The second state visit of Biden's presidency will make Yoon the second South Korean leader to make the visit in 12 years. The Yoon-Biden summit could also be followed by possible trilateral talks with Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida in May. Would you work longer and rest longer? A reform on the current 52-hour workweek has been put on the table in a move to follow global standards, which allow more flexibility in working hours in pursuit of a better work-life balance. Let's begin with the huge proposal out of the office on Monday. The South Korean government announced that voluntary donations from local private sector will compensate Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. That means the Japanese firms responsible won't have to make any payments at all. The unprecedented decision is part of the Yoon administration's push to untangle much knotted relations with Japan after endless rounds of talks on the prolonged matter. On top of sorting out the compensation issue, South Korea announced a temporary pause to its WTO litigation over Tokyo's export curbs on Seoul. Now, before we discuss further, let's first turn to our Shin Ha-young's report on the announcement.
A silver lining for the South Korea-Japan trade relationship. South Korea and Japan decided to launch official talks on lifting of Japan's curbs on exports to Korea, which have been in place since 2019. According to a briefing from Seoul's Trade Ministry on Monday, South Korea announced temporary halt to its World Trade Organization litigation regarding the restrictions, which was compiled in 2019.
The two nations agreed to swiftly conduct bilateral consultations on issues about export regulations to bring the situation back to July 2019. South Korea's government decided to stop the WTO litigation during the talks. Japanese government will hold a policy meeting with Seoul on exports soon.
He added that the announcement was made by Japan's trade ministry simultaneously. Back in July 2019, after South Korea's ruling for the Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor, Japan placed restrictions on its export to South Korea. The export items included 3 major industrial materials that are necessary for South Korea's production of chips and displays. A month later, Tokyo also removed Seoul from its whitelist of preferred trading partners, triggering a strong backlash. In response, South Korea filed a complaint with the WTO over the trade dispute, claiming it was a discriminatory act that goes against WTO rules. Meanwhile, during today's briefing, South Korea's trade ministry said that despite Japan's exports curbs, there was no delay in South Korea's production due to the government's fast response. However, the official added that reliance on Japan regarding imports of materials, parts, and equipment has plunged. The government is expecting to reduce such uncertainties among domestic firms by resolving trade curbs from Japan. The exact date of bilateral talks has not been decided yet, but Seoul's Trade Ministry said it will be taking place soon. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News.
Lots of developments on the soury bilateral ties between South Korea and Japan. From taking a step closer to ending the feud over compensating Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor, to a summit between the leaders of the two countries next week. For this edition of Weekly Focus, we take a closer look at the developing story on the bilateral relations with our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Eun-ji. Welcome, Eun-ji.
Great to be here.
So, the South Korean government announced that it will compensate the victims through a voluntary funding, meaning no compensation from the Japanese side, right?
That's right.
Now, tell us the details about the plan and what's the government's reasoning behind the decision?
Well, the South Korean government announced that a public foundation will be paying the compensation and interest on a delayed payment to the 15 plaintiffs that won the lawsuit against Japanese firms in 2018. The same foundation will also cover the plaintiffs of pending cases if the court rules in their favor. Instead of the accused Japanese firms, Korean businesses that were beneficiaries of the treaty signed in 1965 that normalized bilateral ties will be making contributions to the foundation. That includes South Korea's largest steelmaker, POSCO. Seoul's foreign ministry explained the government came up with this plan so that payments can be made as soon as possible, as many victims have already passed away or are in their 90s. It also said it's aimed at improving relations between the two countries that have been strained for the past several years, as mentioned by Foreign Minister Park Jin.
Relations with Japan should no longer be neglected, and we need to end this vicious cycle in the interest of our nation and our people.
So those who will be receiving the money are the plaintiffs who won the legal battle back in 2018. And that means it's been over 4 years since the court's decision was made. But why haven't the Japanese firms compensated victims yet?
Well, in 3 separate cases, South Korea's Supreme Court ordered 2 Japanese companies, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel, to compensate a total of 15 Korean victims that were forced to work in brutal conditions during World War II. But none of them have been compensated yet, as Tokyo has been insisting all matters were settled under the 1965 treaty signed between South Korea and Japan.
But obviously not everyone appears to be happy, and not everyone's in the same boat regarding the compensation plan from the South Korean government, right? Namely the victims and civic groups, right?
Right. Just this week, there were several protests near Seoul's foreign ministry denouncing the compensation plan. The Korean government says it has left the door open for Japanese corporations to take part in the future, but it's unlikely that they will contribute to the foundation. Of the 15 plaintiffs that won the legal battle in 2018, only 3 are still alive. And all 3 have said they will not accept the money unless it's from the responsible Japanese firms. Among them are Yang Geum-deok and Kim Sung-ju. Both in their 90s, they were forced to work at a Mitsubishi Heavy aircraft factory in Japan when they were teenagers during World War II. And this is what they had to say about the government's recent plan.
나 그런 돈은 꼭 굶어 죽어도 안 받아요. 내가 왜 그런 돈을 받아요? 돈은 안 받아요. 우리나라 힘으로 내가 우리나라에서 고생했지. 일본 가서 고생했지. 누구를 위해서 싸웠가니. 절대 그런 것은 없습니다. 중학교, 고등학교 다 보내주고 일을 하면 월급도 준다. 그래갖고 일본을 끌려갔는데 그것이 말짱 거짓말이고 지진이 일어나서 도쿄로 가옥이 무너진 바람에 친구들이 민명이 그 자리에서 죽고.
So I guess we'll have to wait and see if the foreign ministry or the South Korean government overall will be able to persuade the victims and the civic groups. Now, another big announcement coming out of this week was the summit between South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, right? So let's talk about that.
That's right. Now that they've laid out a plan to settle the compensation issue, the two countries are definitely speeding up efforts to improve relations. 3 days after the compensation plan was announced, Seoul's presidential office said President Yoon will be heading to Japan for 2 days next Thursday for a summit with Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. This marks the first visit by a South Korean president to Japan in 12 years. Yoon's office says Seoul hopes the visit can pave the way for the two countries to move on from the unfortunate history. While the exact details have not been confirmed, the two leaders are expected to discuss ways to overcome the two countries' trade spat and bolster military intel sharing to deter North Korea's nuclear and missile threat. Other possible topics are increasing economic and people-to-people exchanges with a potential meeting of business leaders. This comes after Kishida had said he welcomes South Korea's latest move, saying he hopes to work closely with President Yoon.
Right, and Yoon-Kishida summit will highly likely pave a way for a trilateral talks among the leaders of Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo. Now, also there's GSOMIA, security alliance agreements between the two countries to share sensitive military information. Let's talk about that.
Right, Gisomia has been a rare symbol of security cooperation between the two countries, but has been left in a somewhat unstable state for the past few years. But through the summit between the leaders of the two countries, there is a possibility that it could get back on track. A Japanese media outlet reported Thursday that the Korean government plans to withdraw the documents that notified Japan to end Gisomia in 2019. Citing a South Korean government official, Yomiuri Shimbun said the two leaders will reaffirm the significance of the security pact during their summit next week.
Right, there definitely seems to be lots of signs of improvement on the bilateral relations, especially this week.
Right, we'll have to keep our eyes on how the compensation plan will be carried out and the Yoon-Kishida summit scheduled for next week.
All right, Eunji, thank you for your time today.
My pleasure.
U.S. President Joe Biden will host South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol in Washington, D.C. to mark the 70th anniversary of the two countries' alliance. The state visit is the second of its kind under the Biden administration, and Yoon will be the first South Korean leader to pay a state visit to the U.S. in over a decade.
President Yoon Suk-yeol is set to hold back-to-back summits with the leaders of the United States and Japan in the coming weeks, accelerating efforts to jointly address security threats, including North Korea, and economic challenges. Seoul's top office said on Wednesday that Yoon will visit Washington, D.C. next month, marking the first South Korean state visit to the U.S. since 2011. With a state dinner slated for April 26th, Presidents Yoon and Joe Biden will hold talks under the theme of Alliance in Action. During his visit to D.C. this week, National Security Advisor Kim Sung-han said the focus would be on protecting peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, which he called the basis of the 70-year alliance. Kim said the leaders would seek ways to qualitatively strengthen the allies' capability to offset North Korea's nuclear weapons, noting that the U.S. has reasserted its commitment to extended deterrence, with joint military exercises and the deployment of various U.S. strategic assets as a measures to build trust. On the trade front, Kim added that Seoul will also seek measures to minimize damage to South Korean firms hit by Washington's policies that support domestic production of key industrial products, such as semiconductors. Other agendas for the two leaders are cooperation on advanced technologies, economic security, and people-to-people exchanges, taking the alliance further beyond the realm of military ties. In this regard, the two leaders are expected to discuss furthering their cooperation with Japan, following recent efforts by Seoul and Tokyo to overcome their long-standing disputes. South Korea's plan to compensate Japan's wartime forced labor victims through voluntary donations from the private sector has been challenged domestically, but has drawn a positive response from the US and Japan. According to Japanese media, Tokyo's ruling party chief Natsuo Yamaguchi said on Tuesday that Seoul-Tokyo relations have reached an important turning point, with Prime Minister Fumio Kishida expressing willingness to meet President Yoon even later next week. Observers will closely watch whether Kishida will invite South Korea to the G7 meeting in May. This would set the scene for a trilateral summit of leaders, the third to be held during President Yoon's term. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Lots of news on the diplomatic front, and North Korea was no exception again this week. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un visited an artillery unit with his daughter on Thursday, stressing the need to respond to any war preparations by the enemy. And on the same day, the regime also fired a short-range ballistic missile towards the East Sea. Now, all coming ahead of a series of Seoul-Washington joint drills.
North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un supervised artillery training on Thursday, according to North Korea's state news agency Korean Central News Agency on Friday. Kim visited the Hwasong artillery units on the western front lines to give hands-on guidance. He reportedly said that they must grow and maintain their power to overwhelmingly counteract and suppress the enemy's war preparations. It's possible that he's referring to the Seoul-Washington joint military exercises, as the allies from next week will hold their biggest drill in years, dubbed Freedom Shield. Kim reportedly also took his daughter Kim Ju-ae to the artillery training. She's already appeared by her father's side during several state events this year. The news agency's report follows North Korea's missile firing on Thursday. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said on Thursday that at around 6:20 p.m., North Korea fired a short-range ballistic missile into the waters west of the Korean peninsula. The South Korean military is also looking into the possibility of North Korea firing multiple projectiles that day. And from the newly released photo from North Korea, it looks like at least 6 artillery vehicles fired projectiles. It's also noteworthy that North Korea chose to fire off to the west coast rather than the east. It's the first time in 4 months that the North has fired a short-range ballistic into the West Sea, as the East Coast is their usual choice for missile firings. This latest provocation also marks their 4th confirmed missile firing this year. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
As our Kim Hyun-sung just reported, more joint drills between the two allies are coming up, namely the Freedom Shield slated to begin on Monday for 11 days. That will be conducted on the largest scale in years, which I'm afraid to say that means the North may not hold back with regard to provocations. Staying on the Korean peninsula, drones from North Korea have emerged as a new threat after intrusion into the South Korea's airspace back in January. To counter drone intrusions and attacks from the north, South Korea's military will launch a drone operations command this July. The goal for this summer will come just half a year after the country's Joint Chiefs of Staff unveiled a plan in January to set up the command. The project is an active process, with the military analyzing and taking tips from its allies to ensure efficiency. For example, a visit to Turkey's drone barricade was undertaken recently to share operation and strategy insights. Turkey's barricade is equipped with the Bayraktar TB2. That's an unmanned combat aerial drone that's been used by Ukraine against Russian forces. Also, more analysis on the reclusive regime coming out this week. Let's first begin with what the U.S. had to say on Wednesday.
North Korea has no intention of giving up its weapons program. This from the annual threat assessment from the U.S. Director of National Intelligence released on Wednesday, Washington local time. The report says that the regime's leader Kim Jongun believes nuclear weapons and ICBMs are needed to guarantee his rule and could help make his footing as a nuclear power. He also hopes to shift the regional security situation in his favor while counteracting South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol's hardline stance against the North. This comes as a major threat to the U.S. and its allies. Pyongyang's cyber threats also loom large. Last year, Pyongyang's cyber forces stole $625 million from a Singapore-based tech firm. The U.S. believes North Korea could disrupt some U.S. infrastructure and businesses, albeit in a small or limited way. To deter future cyber threats from Pyongyang, South Korea's foreign ministry said on Wednesday that it is working closely with the U.S. to investigate cyber crimes. However, according to the threat assessment, the biggest threat to the U.S. is China.
People's Republic of China, which is increasingly challenging the United States economically, technologically, politically, and militarily around the world, remains our unparalleled priority.
Speaking at the Senate Intelligence Committee on Wednesday, Washington time, the National Intelligence Director also called out the Chinese Communist Party to be, quote, the most consequential threat, especially as it is deepening its ties with Russia. The DNI report called China a near-peer competitor and revealed that China is building hundreds of new ICBM silos. China's threat could further grow as the country exerts power over Taiwan, a key semiconductor producer. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
And more details on the topic came out of South Korea's National Intelligence Service regarding the children of the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. His daughter Jue has been on the spotlight in the past few weeks with her appearances at public occasions. But the question was, is there a first son? Meaning, does Jue have an older brother? South Korea's intel agency on Wednesday finally came to a conclusion that, yes, Kim Jong-un has an elder son. Now, that could also mean that Kim Jong-un is hiding the existence of his son on purpose or for some reason. But the intel agency rejected speculation that the son may be struggling with mental or physical issues. We do have more updates on the daughter Jue. She's being homeschooled in Pyongyang and enjoys horseback riding, swimming, and skiing. Apparently, she particularly excels at horseback riding, which Kim Jong-un is reportedly very much happy about. According to NIS's data, the possibility of the regime launching an intercontinental ballistic missile at a normal trajectory this spring cannot be ruled out either. Regarding reports on people in the north starving to death, there are some in that unfortunate situation, but this is not severe enough to be considered a threat to the regime yet. Implemented in 2018, the 52-hour workweek in South Korea put a cap on how much overtime workers can do. But the country is looking to allow more flexibility in working hours so that people can take longer breaks after working longer hours. Let's turn to Lee Soo-jin for details.
The South Korean government is aiming to enhance the quality of life for workers and help businesses grow by making changes to the current working hours system. Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho led an emergency meeting on Monday to address the revisions.
We will focus on making related laws and systems more flexible so that employees can concentrate better when they are working and can rest and use their vacation days more freely as long as there's an agreement between the employee and the management.
The government is making changes to the overtime work system, which many have criticized due to labor shortages suffered by smaller firms. Under the current rules, the maximum number of working hours is 52 hours per week, including 40 regular hours and a maximum of 12 in overtime. However, under the proposal, the overtime hour limit is to be calculated on a monthly, quarterly, half-yearly, or yearly basis, allowing companies to increase maximum weekly work hours up to 69 with a guaranteed rest period of 11 hours. Total overtime hours allowed on a monthly basis now comes to 52 hours, 140 hours quarterly, 250 hours on a half-yearly basis, and 440 hours annually. The nation's selective working hour system could also see changes. Currently, employees at companies where the system is in place can decide their start and finish times along with the number of hours they work each day, as long as they do not exceed the 52 hours per week limit for a period of 1 month. The government wants to extend that period from 1 month to 3 months to allow more flexibility. And the plans include further efforts to ensure that workers get enough rest time, with workers able to exchange overtime hours worked for paid leave.
The government intends to create a new working hour standard that guarantees choice, health, and rest in order to meet global standards.
The revisions will be submitted to the National Assembly for approval between June and July. However, it may not be easy for the reforms to go through, as the ruling People Power Party faces opposition from the Democratic Party, which currently holds the majority. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
But there were mixed reactions to the proposal. The Korea Enterprises Foundation welcomed the plan, calling it a starting point for a labor reform that improves outdated labor laws and systems, whereas labor fields voiced concerns that the plan may lead to more working hour work week pressure while not guaranteeing enough breaks for workers. Last year, private education spending reached record highs. It was due to pandemic anxiety that parents had as they felt edgy about their children's schoolwork during the crisis. Let's first turn to Lee Soo-jin for detailed figures.
Parents in South Korea are relying on private education more than ever. Data from Statistics Korea on Tuesday shows that spending on private education by elementary, middle, and high school students last year rose nearly 11% on year to 26 trillion won, or around $20 billion at the current exchange rate. The Korean won figure is the highest on record since data was first compiled in 2007. That's despite the number of students dropping 0.9% in a single year to 5.28 million in 2022. More than 78% of elementary, middle, and high school students partook in private education, up 2.8% from 2021, recording another record high. Data also shows that 7.2 hours were spent in private education sessions each week last year, up 30 minutes from 2021. The average monthly spending on private education stood at around $315.6, up nearly 12% from a year earlier. The agency attributed the surge to parents worried about their children falling behind academically due to pandemic-related disruptions.
Parents are still anxious about the possibility of their children in first, second, and especially in third grade experiencing learning deficits due to the pandemic.
By subject, money spent on English was the highest, followed by math and Korean. The subject that saw the biggest on-year growth in spending was Korean, with 13% reflecting parents' concerns about their children's language development being impaired by mask wearing during the pandemic. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Education said that it will announce measures to address rising private education expenditure for the first time in 9 years during the first half of the year. 이수진, Arirang News.
Another notable point was that there was a huge rise in spending on elementary school students. And that shows more and more parents are starting to invest in private education for their children at a younger age. Plus, higher inflation does more expensive private education. That is all we have for you. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.